made our decision to show the Father's love with great power from above. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We do our marching to one beat, rushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Let us reach this generation, every tribe and every nation, for we've overcome the world by the blood of Christ the Lamb. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We do our marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and tower. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Fight our battles on our knees. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We do our marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and tower. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Our faith. Fight our battles on our knees. We are united.
I want to start this morning to say thank you for being here, and those at home too. I did hear that the choir is singing at the beginning of the 9:30, so they might be joining us as well, and I told them always welcome. So I am Missy. I've led a few of these presentations. I have two quick announcements this morning. First of all, I want to make sure everybody got a bulletin or a piece of paper. If you've ever gone to any of the presentations I've done, you know I make you do a little work, which is going to lead into some homework. Kind of my philosophy. If you don't practice it outside of this 45-minute presentation, then nothing's going to change. So I promise no quizzes, nothing too difficult there, but just something I want you to do throughout the week. When you come back, I will be presenting next week as well, so it'll lead into that. The second thing I want to say is a small disclaimer. I feel like throughout the weeks, this is week 7, there's been a couple comments about, well, you know, Missy will cover that when she presents, and then Missy will cover that when she presents. So I do feel a little more pressure today, and I think what I need you guys to know, I am not an expert at all. In fact, I think more so than some of the other presentations I've done, you're going to see I have a lot of notes, and I'm going to need to refer to these notes. I love facilitating, and I'm sure Andrew and other people who have done this would say the same thing. The reason I love facilitating is I think I actually end up learning more than I'm going to share with you guys. The amount of prep we put into this, to read the book, to do extra research, look into other things, I promise you I've given this a lot of time, but not because I'm an expert, because I'm one of you. And I am up here today simply to facilitate these discussions. I do not have the answers. So there's my small disclaimer as we go forward here. Oh, Andrew already quit. He's out of here. So this is week 7 of a series. You did not have to be here all of the other weeks. In general, this is how we love, and so there was kind of an introductory done by Don, and then we broke it into the different what we call kind of injured love styles, and then finally last week Leanne did speak about the ideal, that secure connector. I was speaking with someone a couple weeks ago, and we were having this discussion as we were leaving about how so often the facilitators will ask a question. And then we're thinking, but it's not until we've moved on that we realize, oh shoot, I do have a thought on that. There is something I would like to say. And so often, if you're anything like me, it's actually when I leave, and for me, I love working out, and that's my time to reflect and think. And so it's like, oh my gosh, I wish I would have said this, and I wish I would have said this and this. So I do want to start this morning just about, this has been over 6 weeks of talking about this topic. Does anybody have any thoughts, questions, insights here, just thinking about the last 6 weeks? Any leftover business? Okay. And the one thing I promise I'm very comfortable with wait time, so we can wait. I just want to make sure, there hasn't been. And I guess I should say then, if I am presenting, my goal is never to get through a presentation, it's to lead a discussion. Good morning. I am going to ask, always welcome, you guys just to take one of those bulletins, and everybody needs a bulletin, because I let everybody know you are going to have a little work today that will lead to some homework. Good morning, good morning. Okay, so, yes, no, you have to stay. You have to stay. You and Andrew are going to run. Okay, so just threw it out there. Any leftover thoughts, questions, comments? Okay. Just want to make sure. And at any point, if you do, throw that hand up and just interrupt me. So today I am covering the identifying your love style. And I was the one, as soon as Don assigned these last 2 weeks to me, I was the one that switched it. And hopefully you'll understand why today as we talk about this. But this week we're talking about actually identifying those love styles. To start with, I'm going to kind of review the what is it, why is it important, and then we'll go into how we identify that, leading into that reflection and homework. So first up, so far, what have you learned about what a love style is? Every week, how would you guys describe what a love style is?
It's our handicap. It is our go-to, and it's just what we are predisposed, how we are predisposed to think and act and react to how other people treat us.
I love that you said react, because we'll talk about that. Any other thoughts there? I read this book, and like Andrew offered too, I am willing to give it to anybody. It is worth a read. But I like when they talk about love styles, it's ultimately the patterns of relating, or how we connect to others, that we initially learned in childhood and then we carry into adulthood. So the patterns of relating and how we connect that we learned early on and then we carry to that adulthood. What I really want to emphasize, sitting in the audience throughout the weeks, and we've had some different discussions which I will bring up, I want to emphasize that a love style is to do with emotional connectedness, okay? That is where I really want us to understand it is where we feel emotionally connected to those significant others in our lives. So early on, there was some question and comments about, okay, I kind of feel like I'm this, but not in the workplace, not necessarily in this relationship. And that's where I want you to remember, this is not your personality, it's not your temperament, any of those things. It's how you relate to someone else and feel emotionally secure. So that's only going to be with your children, your spouses, your best friends, your parents. It's not necessarily going to be in that work relationship. Why is it important? I want to go back when I was hoping there was going to be a delay there. So why is it important to talk about our love style? Why should we spend 8 weeks talking about this? Why should Missy give you homework on this? Yeah.
I think because everywhere we go, we're in relationships, whether it's at home or it's at work or it's at the grocery store, you're interpersonally relating with everybody around you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I always go to the Bible. The Bible, Genesis 2:18 says, then the Lord said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. Absolutely. And again, this connectedness is a lot of different relationships, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the imprinting. But God said it's important, okay? We are human. That's what makes us unique. We are born to connect to other people. So because those relationships are inevitable, let's spend time on them. We all can speak to experience that these don't just happen, right? Yeah, Andrew.
Well, not only inevitable, but uber important. I mean, set aside our relationship with God. The most important relationship on earth is with that of your spouse and your children. And so, like, if you can improve that by knowing how you're wired / what you're predisposed to think and say, and how you react, and how you will react with one another, and how you'll mold with one another, I think it's worth the investment of time and mental energy to, learn about this.
And Andrew brings up children. Who in here has children? Okay, almost all of us. I like Andrew's emphasis on it's his relationship with his wife, right? But there's also, and we'll talk about it, relationships with your children, and your children are watching you and learning from you. We know the importance of that imprinting piece, yes. So why is it important? Absolutely, we need to spend time on this. God told us we need each other, so let's make this the best we can. So now, ultimately, we know what it is. It's emotional connectedness. We know why it's important. God told us it was. But how do we actually learn what our love style is? So far, Don kind of talked about it, that I think each week, depending on the injured or ideal connection, we kind of talked through this. How do we develop our love style? What are a couple of things that are at play there?
We learn from our parents.
So we spent a lot of time, right, on that intimacy imprint. What did we learn from our parents, or some of us brought up the point, like just ultimate, that caregiver who we spent the most amount of time with? Anything else there? And how we develop it? Because I'm going to argue it's not just that caregiver.
I mean, we kind of talked about like the nature versus nurture thing. Like, no matter what, Don was programmed a little bit by the good Lord to be more of the controller type. Like, just his personality was not going to have him be a pleaser. So I would argue that, and I don't know that the book focused on that a ton, as we kind of chatted about.
Right.
But I would argue that, yes, we were definitely predisposed more so towards one or another love style than the second.
And Andrew and I did have a little chat, having read this book, and then, we're supposed to come out and present on it. And every book, presentation, research study, whatever comes into my brain, my ultimate goal is to have one takeaway, right? It doesn't mean that this book is the be-all, end-all, and I don't think it did talk about a lot of these different things. But it got me thinking about the intimacy imprint, some of those. So as long as I have a takeaway, I feel like it's a pretty good thing. For me, I think there's 3 big pieces here. So one, that first thing, it starts with God, okay? So Psalms 139:13. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together. God created us all, and Andrew kind of said, Don, a certain way. So he creates us with a personality, a temperament, a disposition. So first of all, it does start with who we are because of how God made us, okay? Step 2, God creates us with physical and emotional needs, okay? And all of those physical and emotional needs can be very different. If you just take 30 seconds here, think about each of your children. And I know last time, a couple weeks ago, we kind of talked a little bit about this. But take a second and think about each of your kids. Raise your hand if you think each of your kids had the same physical and emotional needs. Look around. Nobody's hand goes up, right? Go back to this. If God made us all unique with a certain personality, disposition, all of these pieces, he made us with physical and emotional needs. No, they're not the same. So first of all, into this love style, we've got how God made us. God made us with different physical and emotional needs. We know when we get to that love style, it is about how we fulfill those needs. So heck yeah, it's going to be different. Second, and this came up that first week, and this is kind of where the book takes off from. What do you guys know about attachment theory? Does anybody know just kind of the gist of it? Anybody? Okay, So I will not get too clinical here. My background is in social worker and counseling, but ultimately there was a psychiatrist and psychologist, Bowlby, who developed the attachment theory that said by 18 months of age, if that young person has created a secure bond with a caregiver, they're going to have a secure connection. If they don't, and I won't get too detailed here, if they didn't get that secure attachment, they're going to end up kind of with this anxious attachment or this avoidant attachment. And what Kate did is she kind of took this a step further. The pieces from attachment theory that are absolutely important, though, is that the quality of the bond that that young person has is what determines how well they're going to relate to people later in life. Ultimately, how they're going to respond to that intimacy. So the main emphasis with attachment theory is by 18 months of age, what you get right then is what's going to impact those future relationships, which is what Kate talked about. I liked this quote from the book: God designed us to need connection, and our relationship with our parents or caregivers is the first place this happens or doesn't happen. The other two things that I kind of take away from that attachment theory is ultimately those primary caregivers are either available and responsive to my individual needs or they're not. And then that kind of results in those different connections. The child's emotional bond with their primary caregiver is the most important piece, and any kind of disruptions can lead to a loss of those bonds. So ultimately, Kate kind of took this, how people respond to those physical and emotional needs is ultimately that big second step to how we develop those love styles. Ultimately, God made us, there's a personality, there's a temperament, there's a disposition, and then how that caregiver, I'm going to keep saying that in case it's not apparent, responds to those needs. Kate says, I'm going to take it a step further. So then comes Kate and Milan and into our intimacy imprints. Now that we have kind of had some different discussions. So what do you guys remember about intimacy imprints? I'm not going to let Andrew answer.
It's like through age 5, right?
Yeah.
Of how you were shown love and attention and who was available and were your needs being met.
Yes. So now I want you guys, and I think this is a part that wasn't touched on a lot in the book. In the very first week, there was a gentleman over here who's not here today, but he kind of brought this up. So I want you guys to think about, for you, all the things that happened by the age of 5, or think, if it was a long time ago, think about your kids. When we think about this intimacy imprint happening by the age of 5, first, I'm going to go back to this. God made us with a certain personality, temperament, disposition, so we've got these qualities. He makes us with these needs. I want to throw in here, things not discussed were like birth order. How might birth order affect this? Anybody have siblings in here?
I'm thinking about when your kids are really close together, if you're saying 18 months, like, it's, like, that nail's in the coffin, and you have with your first kid, and you have another kid there already, like, you just can't give them as much undivided attention. But, so the whole thing with the intimacy imprint, though, is how many kids actually have, like, those core memories from before the age of 5?
Right. And I'll tell you from a statistical, they won't.
Okay.
All the research says it is about at the age of 5 that will be our first honest memories.
Okay.
I think for me, think about birth order, and I like that you bring up. So you think about that first child, and they were the only one you had to do all that time and energy on, right? So you probably could meet every physical and emotional need. Now think logistically. Child 2 comes, 3. Chris, you got 4. I can't even imagine. How do you, and this is where I liked that discussion those first few weeks of, it might not come from you. It might come from those other relationships. Birth order, and I love these, when you research birth order in general, they always talk about those firstborns tend to be more dominant. They like control. Any firstborns in here? Okay. Second, in the middle, so this could be 2 or 3. In general, middleborns are the type O blood type of relationship. So they can kind of go with anyone. They said they tend to be good at compromise, but they also can be secretive because they don't have anything of their own. So they tend to hold on to some things of their own. Anybody middle children? Okay, last one. In general, the youngest tends to be babies, coddled longer, and thus more dependent and needy. Any babies? I'm a baby, okay? Now I push back with this right away. But what it caused me to do, and these are just generalizations, what it did cause me to do is kind of reflect on that. And a little bit, way too much information about me and how I was raised. I had 2 older brothers, and we were right in a row. So to say my parents met every physical and emotional need of us 3, it was impossible. So there's kind of 12 months between my first 2 brothers and 11 months between my brother. Needless to say, I was an accident. But the 3 of us are growing up, and I can still remember on so many occasions, because I was the only girl, and I'm sure I was more babied and coddled than I was supposed to. But that kind of grew this fight in me, because my brothers learned to use that against me, and they'd be like, oh yeah, Missy can't mow the lawn, Missy can't do this, Missy, and I'm like, yes I can. Well, then ultimately I end up doing all of their chores because I wanted to show them how I am not the baby, I'm not coddled, I can do all of these things. Still a joke to this day. So I think birth order plays a part, but again, I gotta go back to that personality. Because I had this, that is not gonna be true for me, I kind of push back with those general roles. But birth order does have a part in here. Another one is, again, I think because for most of us it's having us reflect on that parent relationship, I do like the word caregiver, because the one week the one girl kind of said it was my older sibling that had more of that role with me. It might be grandparents, it might be a babysitter if your parents both work full-time and we're not around. So think of this in general of those caregivers. I also like that they say by the age of 5. So now let's take a second and think of all the things going on around the age of 5. First of all, you're starting school, most kids. So now they have other relationships in their life than just a parent. This is the first time that a lot of them are developing their own peer relationships, not because of dad's friend or the neighborhood kid, but now I am developing those relationships on my own. It's the first time where a lot of them will start a new activity or sport or music or one of these where, again, there's all these other adults coming into their lives that might play a role in that meeting of the physical and emotional needs. Also have to throw in there, just because of my background, Erickson's stages of psychosocial development. This is where there's that initiative versus guilt. So I want to be independent. I'm going to start to do these things, but then also second guessing those things. So there is a lot at play by 5 years old other than just that parent relationship. So we've got God made us, then we moved into that attachment theory by 18 months, and then ultimately into those intimacy imprints. Ultimately, all of this is just to say that those early relationships affect our current relationships and those core patterns, which we're really going to get into next week, kind of how we relate to each other. Next up, I kind of want to talk about the how. So right now, does anybody kind of have an idea, and I promise I'm not going to call on you, so it is safe to raise your hands. Kind of have an idea of where you're falling. I think this is my love style. And again, I won't call on you, I promise. Okay, good. And I'm kind of falling where a lot of you guys are. I think what's been powerful over the past few weeks is, one, that first week, Don did have us go through all of those characteristics to say, hey, where might you be falling? And I was circling the ones that were true of me. If you guys are anything like me, I didn't have none on any of them. I certainly had a few more circles on some of them. Then I went online and took the quiz. Did anybody do that? Okay, the quiz? I don't know about the quiz. There's a lot of harsh questions there. So then I go online and I do that quiz. And then I've been a very attentive student the past few weeks, listening to how each of these different, what we said, kind of hurt or injured styles come out, okay? So I feel like, okay, I have an idea. There's a couple I'm leaning towards. I think there's a few things I want to point out as we go forward here. I gotta go back. So sorry. When we think about our love style, before I get into this true reflection and homework, where you guys are gonna really work on identifying what your love style is, I think it's important that we talk about these different pieces. First of all, our love style is not permanent. What's interesting, and I no slam at Kate and Milan who wrote the book at all, but they wouldn't write a book and have a workbook if they thought they were permanent, because there would be no need for us to spend time on this, right? So the reason they wrote this book and there's a workbook and we're talking about it now is it isn't permanent. We can grow from what we learn about ourselves. The goal in identifying your love style to Kate and Milan really is to reflect, to evolve, to become closer to that ideal connector. Second point, it is a starting point. Like, I feel like the first week did a pretty good job of saying this is not about blame or kind of focusing on what our parents did to us, right? It's just a time to reflect, and then it's our job to use it to go forward. So it is just a starting point. The third point over here, kind of what now? This is the most powerful thing I do as a living and in my personal life. I'm always like, you know that saying 10% is what happens to us, 90% is what we do with it. And that is definitely ingrained in my brain. So 10% is, hey, let's take some time and reflect on this. But 90% of this is going to fall to us and what we're going to do with that information, like Andrew said at the very beginning, so that we do get a stronger connection to our spouse, to our children, to our parents, whoever that person is. So the what now is the most important thing. When we reflected early on of our parents and all of those, I think for a minute there it was like, oh yeah, especially when I thought about sibling relationships and some of these pieces. For me though, that what now really starts at the end of this 8-week series, and this is what you guys take forward. Identifying your love styles is going to have two parts. And next week, I'm going to really go into what we call those challenging combinations, the core patterns, and then ultimately how to get to more of that secure connection. Andrew gave that circle of kind of the 4 steps there. But for me, I want you to focus on, in the next few minutes we'll do this, 2 different parts to identifying our love style. One is ours. What do we, and the magic question here is, what do I need to feel more emotionally secure to that person? For that takes an awareness. And I think what gets hard in relationships is I'm going to ask you to take the time to identify that, because so often in relationships, some of our repeated fights or those core patterns is because I expect you to know. And 9 times out of 10, we don't even know, yet we expect that person to. So a lot of this is going to be us spending time figuring out what our love style is, which goes back to those other 3 things: how God made me, what's my personality, disposition, temperament, attachment theory, and those imprints. But the second part is now my significant other. This could be a spouse, this could be a child, it could be a parent, them learning about themselves, and then we get into the sharing piece. I want to take a second here just to talk about the spouse or significant other identifying there. Early on, one of the quotes in the book that Don referred to was, it's going to be important you have a PhD in your spouse's upbringing, okay? I agree with that, but I want you to be careful here. There's a saying in my house, blood to blood and blood about blood. So what I mean here, I do not want you guys, when you are in the practice of identifying what those love styles are, it is not your job to identify your spouses or significant others, okay? We got to be careful with that. It can lead to defensiveness, especially if we're starting to share, I think you're this because your mom did this and your dad did this, and kind of what we call diagnosing. Don't ever diagnose your significant other. Blood to blood, blood about blood, what that looks like for me is, believe me, I am happily married. I love my in-laws. I want to go on record in case they watch this. I love my in-laws, okay? But when there is some, I think my husband does this because, wow, watch how the dad does it to the mom and these types of things. I bite my tongue. Now, 9 times out of 10, Matt will share, you know, I noticed this about myself, and I think I get it from my dad. Inside, heck, yeah, you do. But your role there is to be the listener. We're going to talk about that a lot next week, how important that role. Blood about blood. I take it a step further to say, when there is that frustration and something's going on, we truly believe it is my husband's job to talk to his family about those things, and it is my job to talk to my family about these things. Quick story for you, and I won't get into the details, but my dad left my mom, ended up being with another woman, moved to London, and yep, a hot mess there, okay? My husband, still to this day, has never said a bad thing about my dad. Do I think he thinks bad things? Heck yeah. He has never said a bad thing about my dad. Even if I am venting and saying all the things I feel, which I'm sure he feels, he still has that face. Now, we're both counselors, so maybe that helps. But the point being, when we get into these two parts, your job when your spouse or significant other, maybe it's your child, maybe it's your parent, is sharing theirs, in your head, it's okay to disagree. In your head, it is great if we can form questions that help that person reflect on that, maybe a little more accurately, but do not get into the habit of diagnosing or saying, okay? Because next week we're going to talk a lot about what truly that awareness looks like and that engagement, and when you share, when that person shares. If we start to diagnose or jump in there, all you're going to do is shut that down. I work all day, every day with adolescents, and I always say to parents, the best strategy you can ever have when you're listening, bite your tongue, because the more you don't say, what do? They keep talking, right? It's the second we talk that people stop talking. So your job as a listener, when your spouse is sharing or your significant other, that's the important part. So remember, there's two very important parts here. The goal in these two parts is truly empathy. What's the difference between empathy and sympathy? So empathy, I'm literally going to step in your shoes and feel you, okay? Sympathy is I feel sorry for you. There's no place of sympathy in these two parts, okay? It is truly empathy. For a minute, while that significant other is sharing their part, just step in their shoes. Be them for a little bit of time, okay? And that's important. The whole reason we want these two parts is not to stay stuck, not to blame, not to talk about our in-laws or anything like that. It is truly so that, and next week we'll talk about this, how do we grow from this point? Okay, we know all of this, now what? The last part is I just want to fly through. There are some, and back to that, when Don had us kind of first week, here's all these characteristics of these 5 different injured styles, and I'm circling things on there. There are some similarities. There are some overlaps. It is important to know that these love styles are on a continuum. So I want to fly through some of those because I think, you know, when I said who kind of has an idea of their love style, very few hands came up, which is true of me, and I think it's because of some of these similarities. So let's first start with avoider and pleaser. What do you guys see as some of the similarities between avoider and pleaser? So the one statement that comes up for me is neither of them like to deal with what I would call those negative, messy emotions, right? So avoider and pleaser, neither one of them want to deal with those negative, uncomfortable ones. Pleasers don't like conflict, so they avoid those pieces, those emotions that are going to be more what they perceive as negative. Avoiders view feelings as a foreign language. So pleasers, I want all the positive ones but not the negative ones, but a true avoider just doesn't want the emotions. Another thing is they both lack the skills necessary to deal with those challenging emotions. If we are going to work on a relationship that is important to you and you want to be more emotionally connected, we know there are going to be those rough spots. And both pleasers and avoiders don't like approaching those rough spots. Pleasers are pretty good at being empathic, but pleasers get anxious, and this is the hard part with being a pleaser sometimes. Pleasers get anxious and they want their own anxiety to go down, and that is why they're pleasing the other. So they actually have this self-driven piece there that I need this to go away, so I'm going to be nice to you. Pleasers fix by excusing, distracting, minimizing, and looking kind of on that bright side. Pleasers kind of view love equals rescuing others and kind of rescuing them from those negative emotions. For a pleaser, it's difficult for them to see that their primary motive is really their own. Now let's flip to those avoiders. Avoiders lack empathy. So pleasers kind of got it nailed down because they're trying to step in your shoes so that they can make you feel better, so it makes me feel better. Avoiders, though, again, they don't want to be empathic. They don't try to step in your shoes. They just want to avoid those emotions. Avoiders put a high value on responsibility. Where pleasers can be too soft, avoiders can be too harsh. Pleasers attempt to fix, but avoiders really are just trying to dismiss it. Pleasers become anxious in the stress, and what do avoiders do? They detach, right? That's when I'm out. So when we look at they both, again, when you look at and you're kind of circling those different things, they both don't want those negative emotions, but for two kind of different reasons. All right, pleasers and vacillators. What do we got there? What's kind of similar and what's different?
They want that connection. In both cases.
Yes, well said. So they both try to be nice to make others happy, okay? So a pleaser and a vacillator want the others to be happy. But their motives really differ. Pleasers are nice, again, to avoid that conflict, those uncomfortable feelings. Why are vacillators nice? Do you guys remember what their motive was? Vacillators are nice to get the attention of that other and feel valued, right? So the question really between these two comes down to, for me, is do you get mad? This is the best way for me to describe the difference. A pleaser, again, is not going to get mad, right? A pleaser is trying to avoid conflict, trying to avoid anything that would result in those uncomfortable feelings. Vacillators do get mad. Why? When would a vacillator get mad?
They get let down.
Yes, 100%. A vacillator, as soon as you don't meet their expectation and they feel let down, now I'm mad. So a vacillator, if you don't meet this expectation, if you let me down, now I'm going to show anger. So there's the difference between those two. Pleaser and victim. What might a pleaser and a victim have in common, and where might they differ? And believe me, I get to take these notes because I read this and read this and read this. I'm kind of asking you guys for a lot here.
They both kind of want to avoid conflict. They both kind of go with the flow to try to keep the peace.
100%. They both try to be good, right?
Right.
I'm going to be good. I'm walking on eggshells, but I'm going to be good so that my spouse, that significant other, doesn't react. Both are afraid of that conflict. Both lack boundaries and have a difficult time standing up to that other person. But the difference here is a pleaser is that kind of what I would say classic codependent relationship. So as a kid, they learn to take care of themselves, stay in the role. Yes, I'll do that. Maybe do chores, do all of those things to avoid. Again, they're kind of walking on eggshells. Avoid any kind of conflict or something to happen. A victim truly probably has that unresolved trauma. Something very specific happened in there. So their parent did not comfort and protect them. Instead, they were a true source of fear. And so that victim is going to share that their childhood was probably more chaotic. Both have anxiety, but victims endured trauma, which turns that anxiety. Both of them kind of learn to, like I said, walk on eggshells and deflect at all times. All right, two more for you. The vacillator and controller. How are they kind of similar? What would be different? Vacillator and controller. What emotion do they both share? Anger, right? So they're both quick to anger. Easy to say, like I always, and this was a good reflection for me. Vacillator and controller, the more I learned about these two, it's kind of easy to say they're the most harmful or harsh, right? But I liked this point. God doesn't condone lying or some of these other behaviors any more than he does anger. And when we look at avoiders, pleasers, and victims, what do they all tend to do? Be dishonest. even maximize that truth in order to avoid conflict. And so I like to reflect on that, because at first when you read these, you're like, oh my gosh, who wants to be a controller and a vacillator? They're angry. They tend to have these negative pieces to them. But we got to reflect back. God doesn't want that pleaser to lie, doesn't want that avoider. So let's not beat them up too much here. Differences between that vacillator and controller. Vacillator is angry again because they are disappointed about not getting enough time, attention, what they wanted out of that. The controller, on the other hand, at all times wants it to be in this box, and so their anger is going to be because you didn't follow the rule, you didn't follow the expectation there. So just some differences as we go forward, because we're going to get into this reflection here in a second. I want you to recognize you're not going to have all of one, okay? There's a continuum, and they kind of overlap here. So again, back to the fact that we took that quiz. We've had a lot of discussion. Now I'm going to ask you guys to do some serious reflection. For me right now, if you have a bulletin, there's a spot on here where I'm just going to ask some guided questions, and I want you to think for yourself. This is where I really want us to pause back on that attachment. I'm going to go back to personality, attachment theory, and those intimacy imprints. For me, when I reflected early on, it's very easy for me to kind of jump based off these descriptors of which one I was. But I didn't, until I was going to teach this, really take the time to reflect back very detailed on those intimacy imprints. So if you guys would, because this will be part of your homework, if you've got a pen in that reflection area, I'm going to ask some guided questions, and I just want you guys to jot down how you would answer those. So first up, just a general, what do you remember about your childhood? Very specifically about being comforted. So take a second. What do you remember about being comforted when you were a child? What do you remember about when you felt sad, hurt, or disappointed? And if you think about this, ultimately the question is, did you feel heard, supported, or validated, and by who? So I had these emotions, sad, hurt, frustrated. Did someone support me and validate me, and who was it? If you don't remember feeling truly validated and heard, what did you do to feel the comfort yourself? So I didn't get it from a person, but I remember these were the things I did for myself that I did feel comforted. Now reflect on conflict in your family. How was conflict handled? Did you see conflict? Was it evident? Think about touch. Was touch important in your family? How did you use touch? How are your caregivers at listening and validating emotions? Did they try to solve it for you, offer false assurances, or sit back and support? Were all emotions allowed? Something to think about here as you reflect on some of these love styles. I think for some households, anger was more acceptable than sadness or fear, because sadness and fear bring in what? What's hard about sadness and fear? That's our vulnerability, right? So think about all emotions. Were some of them more acceptable because of that vulnerability or how they were viewed, or were all emotions acceptable? What's hard for me with anger so often, if you really study it, is that anger often blocks the awareness of what someone might perceive as those unacceptable emotions. So when that anger is there, what did that look like? Why was it anger? Was it really anger, or were it some of these other emotions? A few more for you guys. As you reflect on your parents' or caregivers' relationships, what did you see in them? First question is kind of reflecting on what love styles you saw in your parents or caregivers or parent. And then next to that is, what did you take from them or not because you didn't want to be there? So reflect on your caregivers' love styles and what you might have taken from them. Are you like them, or how are you different? Now, it's likely when we look at attachment theory through 18 months, intimacy imprinting through 5 years, you had other relationships than that first one, that mom or that dad or that grandparent. So think about those relationships for a minute. Siblings, babysitters, other caretakers, grandparents. What do you remember about those relationships? How were you comforted by those people or not? Were your emotional needs met by those people or not? And now I want you to fast forward to present day. Okay, so today, think about your relationships you have the most secure attachments with. And let's do a positive here. Think about, why do you think there is a secure attachment there? What am I doing in that relationship? And what is that person doing? So think about a relationship where you have a secure attachment. They are meeting my social emotional needs. What am I doing in that relationship? And what is the other person doing? And just jot a couple notes there. If you reflect on that relationship. What I think this question causes us to do is really think about what it is, what it looks like, what I feel to have a secure relationship with someone. We all know what it's not and when I don't feel that way, but I really want you to take time to name what are the pieces that I do and someone else does for me to feel emotionally secure. This is really tough sometimes, because for us to be emotionally secure in a relationship and feel that true connectedness, it is more about our awareness and ourself than it is just what that person's doing. Last question for you to think about is, now think of that relationship that maybe you don't have the most secure connection with, and my needs are not being met in this. I want you to jot some notes about what those inhibitors are. What do you think is standing in the way of that relationship being a secure connection for you? Reflect on yourself and that other person. What are the inhibitors standing in the way of a relationship you want to have a more secure relationship with? And then lastly, there's a little spot on there. I had Don list the different injured love styles as well as the secure connector. And I want you to think about the things you've learned this week, but also little notes on there for you to remember who is what. And I want you to identify which love style you feel like you are most like, keeping in mind there's similarities, there's overlap, and there's a continuum there. But I want you to name one love style that you feel like you are most like. And I want you to write it in that box or on that line. You guys might see that blend of love styles, but when you write the one down, it's leading into our homework here. The reason I want you to write it down is I want you guys to think of a relationship. I think when Don came to us and said, hey, let's do this series, the idea was this relationship would be your spouse. But if there is a relationship that, let's say spouse, it could be one of your children. It could be a parent. It could be a sibling. I want you to think of a relationship that you want a more secure connection with, and I want you to view yourself in that relationship and identify your love style by that. All right, homework time. First of all, just a quick question. I know I only have a few minutes left here. How was that for you guys? Taking the time, those guided questions, kind of walking through it. How was that for you?
For me, it was very helpful because I felt like I was one on another, and then this helped me. Like there was a word that kept repeating, and I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense.
I'm glad, and I will be honest, I did this to myself because again, I'm looking at the descriptors and I was so focused on the descriptors and it would fall different areas, but then my head would say, wait a minute. Personality, that attachment theory, that intimacy imprint, and how many years you're talking there. Yes, there were some younger ones, but now there's some now ones. And I think ultimately that's the biggest takeaway I have from this book is think about all of those things to get to who am I now. But the only reason this is important, you guys, is because God made us to need connection. And when you talk about a love style, I need you to keep saying in your head, love style is ultimately how I feel emotionally connected to that person. Said a different way, what that person gives me emotionally to be secure. Okay, so emotional security. So asking all those questions really helped me kind of reflect in a different way. Any other comments on that?
It wasn't easy. I mean, like remembering some of the first few sets of questions, like remembering it, but then also like, you know, who did you get? Wow, you know, it's not easy because there are people perhaps that dropped the ball, or maybe they didn't, or you know, I think as parents we often, you know, I hug my kids more than my parents ever did, that's for sure. And as somebody mentioned before, you know, that's just kind of a changing of culture. I feel like it's far more acceptable now, but you know, those types of things where you just reflect and you think, and it wasn't easy.
It is, you know, like as I reflected on these questions, I think Andrew says, well, I don't want to blame anybody. I'm not jotting these notes because how could you do this to me? It is just to reflect on how I became who I am, right? And then the point of all of us as parents, oh my gosh, everything I do in my life, I hope I pass to you and you only do it better, right? I like that real quick, Andrew kind of brought up the, you know, I hug my kids more than probably I was hugged. Keep in mind there was a discussion, and we'll talk about this a little bit next week, about do we parent different? And I think some ideas out there was, no, I'm the same person in all these relationships. I do challenge you to again focus on your love style in each of these relationships is based off of those emotional needs. So when you think about your 3 children, 4 children, 2 children, I'm going to argue none of them have the same emotional needs. So I do believe the best of parents, you are parenting different if you are that secure connector meeting those emotional needs. So that's going to keep evolving over time. My homework for you, I emphasize this, nothing changes if we don't sit here during that 45-minute, 50-minute presentation and then go practice something, right? So my goal for you in jotting those notes is now to take it a step further. My goal is you pick a relationship, spouse, child, parents, that you want a more secure relationship or secure connection with. And I want you to take your reflection, but then what I want you to do is actually out loud share it with the person you want a stronger relationship with. So I want you to walk through those questions, those notes you jotted down, and shed light to that person about all of those things. Then I want you to switch roles. So if that person that you want a stronger relationship with isn't here today, the good news is you get to role model for them. Hey, I'm in this class, we're learning about secure connection. It is really important to me that we expand our relationship and that I feel that, and then guide those questions. But as I talked about those two parts, then your job is just to listen to that other person. And we talked last week, we're going to talk a lot next week about what listening looks like. Blood to blood and blood about blood. Don't interrupt, just listen to that person share through their guided questions. I want you to take turns, and ultimately this is getting at the awareness piece, how I am the way I am, and then we're starting on that engagement. I am the way I am, and I want to share this with you. Next week, we'll talk about those challenging combinations, get a lot into those core patterns, and then end the best news with what now, getting in the 4 pieces of that circle. Any last minute questions, comments before I close this in prayer? I know I always take the whole time. Everybody understands their homework? And I do call on people when we come back next week. I won't really, because this is a very personal experience. I appreciate the comment of like, it really made me think. I have these other emotions. So my goal is just that activity will help you become more aware. Again, being, I can't expect you to fulfill my emotional needs when I don't even know what they are myself. So I've got to have that awareness. That engagement piece is that vulnerability to say, I want this relationship stronger, so I am willing to be vulnerable and share this with you. Okay, I will close us in prayer here, perfect timing. Thank you, God, for being with us this past hour as we reflected and shared a bit about ourselves and how we feel secure and connected in our relationships. Please continue to be with us this week as we do the homework, ultimately helping us to connect at the level you intended for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks, guys, and we will see you next week. I will be back.